Hello and welcome to Political Business. I'm Nathan Parsad-Wyatt, former Conservative Party candidate and advisor.
And I'm Kevin McKeever, a one-time Labour parliamentary candidate, staffer and advisor to some of Britain's biggest brands.
We've both stood for elections, we've both advised on how to win elections, and our advice continues here on this podcast as the landscape around politics shifts. Whether politically, economically, socially or technologically, old approaches no longer cut through. Welcome to Political Business.
Today's episode, Conservative Party Conference, the party's relationship with business, and does opposition still matter?
I'm up here in Manchester, soaking up the vibes from a sunny but not so rosy party conference.
And I'm down in London battling with the 2025 challenge of finding operational internet. But we've made it, and you've made it up to Manchester. Nathan, tell me, in one word, what's the political temperature like up in Manchester this week?
Well, I don't know that I can do it in one word, but I'll say a few more than that about what the last few days has been. And we should say we're recording this on Tuesday afternoon, so we've still got the party leaders' a set-piece speech coming tomorrow. The message from the Conservatives has been pretty clear. It is stronger borders and a stronger economy. They've delivered that message well. The issue they've got is anyone really listening? There's two key questions going on the fringes and two key things that everyone's talking about here. And that is, frankly, one, how long does Kemi Badenoch have as leader? She started with a poll rating. The Tories were sort of around 26% in the polls. That today is in the high teens in some polls. So I think lots of people are getting pretty nervous that the first year of her leadership has not necessarily been as successful electorally as she would like. And the second point that people are raising is, should there be a deal with reform? Could there be a deal with reform? You know, Nigel Farage has sort of loomed over all the party conferences this season, and this is the last one. It's existential for the Conservative Party, given how many of their voters are moving across to reform and have done since the election. So those are the two key things that people are asking behind the scenes.
Let's start with how long does Kemi have? And I think an interesting observation for somebody that isn't in Manchester but is watching it close is it seems really clear that Robert Jenrick and his team have learnt from one Andy Burnham and not repeated the mistakes of last week. At least from the outside, it appears that he hasn't been touting his potential leadership challenge. His team have downplayed his creds and he appears to have rode in reasonably well behind the leader this week. But of course, Nathan, I assume only for his own best interest. They saw what happened to Andy Burnham. He went over the top too soon and quite possibly fatally damaged his leadership ambitions. How does it feel on the ground with Team Jenrick? And what's the chatter about whether or not, when or if he should be the next leader of the Conservative Party?
We're talking about Jenrick as though he has got a leadership campaign and we're in the middle of a leadership election and there's a contest around the corner. You speak to his people, he is clearly waiting. I'm sure would have a go at the top job should a vacancy arise, but I don't think he's agitating to the extent that some people would have you believe. I mean, everyone recognises that 1 year ago the Conservative Party faced a historic defeat at the polls and it was never going to be easy to come back from that. Kemi's job here was to effectively say, look, give me some more time to come up with the solutions to that particular electoral problem. And she's been criticised a lot over the past year for not having any policies at all. She's tried to correct that at this party conference and actually come out with a few policy announcements. And I think probably on balance, whilst all the central problems for the Conservative Party sort of remain the same in that they're a deeply damaged brand and deeply unpopular with large swathes of the electorate, it's not obvious to lots of MPs that would change necessarily if you change the leader. Well, a lot of those problems would still remain the same. So there is a question about who should take over after Kemi, how long she got. I think her mission here was to come and buy some time, and she's probably achieved that. Everyone's looking at next May and what actually happens at actual elections next May to decide next steps. And I suspect that whilst the Conservative Party is extremely anxious at the moment about its long-term survival, that is still going to be quite an important marker.
Of course, you say Kemi Badenoch has potentially bought herself some time, but is that because nobody is selling? I mean, and is there a danger as well, as, you know, obviously nobody wants to have to wear bad results next May, particularly if they've just taken over as leader. So you can see why potential challengers might want to wait. But just to stick on Robert Jenrick for just a little bit longer, is there a danger that he becomes a prince across the water and he becomes the target to take down and never actually wins? I think about David Miliband, and in the words of Peter Mandelson, he said the problem with being the inevitability candidate is you actually actually have to be inevitable, which of course David ultimately wasn't. Is there the space for anybody else to come through?
It's interesting you raise the point, because it is definitely being talked about here. Should there be a contest is the actual question that's being asked. Should it be a Jenrick coronation? Don't forget, this is a party that now only has 120 MPs, not a huge amount of people jumping up and down, going for the top job with lots of credibility. You would think a sort of maybe James Cleverly centrist approach versus a Robert Jenrick contest would be the likely outcome. But I'm told that that's not the preferred option of either one of those two people, and it could possibly be a Jenrick coronation. But of course, as I say, lots to go between now and next May.
So it could be a bit like the chat in Liverpool last week, that potentially both parties don't want to put, or both parliamentary parties would rather in a leadership change did not actually go to its membership. Very interesting indeed. But let's turn to reform. I guess you guys have been chatting in the bars of the Midland and the Radisson and elsewhere about, when there should be a deal, if there should be a deal. But from the other side, from outside the security cordon, I mean, I've been asking these questions, and we're having chats with colleagues over the last 24 hours of conference, is if you reform, why would you do the deal? Nigel Farage, has been rejected by the Conservative Party for most of his career and laughed at. Who's laughing now? The electoral coalition that's coming together behind reform, particularly in areas like Wales, Scotland and the northeast of England, if you become the new vehicle, the new host for the Tory parasite, to put it in particularly strong left-wing terms, what does that mean for the Reform brand? Arguably, it's surging in Wales because it isn't the Conservative Party. So if your Reform was in it for you, but also let's look at the kind of the suite of options. And you and I have discussed this probably ad nauseum. And because we're politicos, we will continue to discuss it ad nauseum, which is you've got an out-and-out deal, not an electoral alliance, a takeover. The Reform Party becomes the party of the right. Option one. Option two is an electoral pact. Maybe informal or formal. So formal, and potentially leaving Reform to fight Labour in the north of England and the Tories to fight the Lib Dems in the south. Perhaps that could be one way of doing it. We saw an informal pact with UKIP, of course, which was very helpful in 2019 for the Conservative Party. And arguably there was a very, very sotto voce informal pact between Labour and the Lib Dems last year. Or that's a second option, or they just do nothing. And actually, if Reform is the Tory lifeboat, let people jump off the Tory ship and swim over. So you get to choose who you take and who you don't. But you don't necessarily get infected with the Tory brand, which, as you say, is probably fatally damaged, at least for now. So what is the chat in the Midland at 2 a.m. about which of those options is the most preferable and why?
Yeah, it's really interesting, because I think the general view here is that for as long as the Conservative Party has the current leadership, that any conversation from the Conservative side about a potential deal is just not going to take place. I think the chatter is if there was a different leader, perhaps somebody who was the Unite the Right candidate, that there could be the space to have a discussion. To your central question, which is what's in this for Reform, well, the short answer right now is not very much. I mean, electorally, they are clearly the brand that is not tainted. They are able to kind of do things perhaps that with no baggage from any kind of previous decision making or any kind of leadership roles in the past. So they're able to position themselves directionally as all things to all people, right? Which is partly the central kind of success of the Reform brand at the moment. But I do think there's a couple of things they cannot get away from. One is the people coming over to Reform that are defecting, and there were another 20 councillors that the party announced, previous Conservative councillors who have gone over to Reform. They are all Conservatives. Danny Kruger, an ideological Conservative. The people that are coming over are undoubtedly Conservatives. And you speak to some MPs here that are on the right of the party, who I would say are on, defection watch, for want of a better phrase, of the current leadership. They're saying, well, look, we're not going to go yet. We just want the party to unite, and we want to unite the right, and we don't want to be fighting people that we consider to be our friends. And I think the other thing is, it's hard just to disentangle how many activists, staffers at Reform, where their support is coming from is all ex-Conservative people coming over. And that creates the space for a conversation about any potential deal or merger, more likely, not less likely.
I think that last comment is really interesting, is that it's very clear both from Reform conference from what you're saying in Conservative conference, but also from Labour conference too in a different way, is that whilst reform might take votes from all parties, it's not taking personnel from all parties. It's primarily coming from the Conservative Party. I think we'll see more of that through the policy development process. I've got a bit of a final thought on this, which is, what if the Conservative Party is salvageable as the sensible centre-right party of sound money, and reform, potentially as it takes power, starts to make mistakes which makes it less attractive for national government. I think about the press piece in the FT, which has been definitely widely shared on Labour WhatsApp groups, which is that the Doge-style unit that went into Kent County Council, previously Conservative controlled, has, one, not found any massive savings, two, has discovered that actually most councils are run pretty efficiently and that they're basically providing core statutory services, in particular social care, and that three, in order to provide those statutory services on an ongoing basis into the future, they may have to raise taxes. Could it be that people could cross the water to reform and find that actually the grass isn't greener? We're going to mix my metaphors.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's it's being shared in all circles, that article about the 5% tax hike in Kent. But yes, you're right. I mean, I think that the reforms, when you speak to people that are thinking about defecting, and there are lots of those conversations happening, you should be really clear about that. There's people talking about when, not if. But the thing they say is that we're not convinced on the party's economic message. They're relatively convinced on the immigration piece. They're relatively convinced on the kind of desire to deregulate, and kind of reform is a Thatcherite party, whether they want to admit that or not. It's filled up with people who generally believe the state should be smaller. But on the central message of, okay, how would you actually manage the books and balance the books on a daily basis? They've made some unbelievable spending commitments that would make Liz Truss seem like a responsible person looking after the nation's finances. And I think people are going to be scared about that. And what is the question at the next election? You'd hope that by that point something will have been done about the situation with small boats. You'd hope that there is coalescing of immigration policy around all the major parties. You can see that it's already toughening up from everybody talking about it, and particularly the government. So it's likely to be based on the economy at the next election, and that could be reforms Achilles heel. That's the thing that gives the Tories a little bit of hope, and actually probably what we should come on to talk to next. What is the Conservative Party's relationship with business and the economy?
Absolutely. I mean, and that is fascinating because, of course, whilst reform might be soaring in the polls, we are still 4 years away from a general election. That doesn't just mean that there's a Labour government, but of course there is official Conservative opposition. It holds the mic in Parliament, at least when it comes to business policy. I saw some interesting comments out of the Shadow Business Secretary on particular support for the hospitality industry, which, as we know from last week and from the budget, it feels like it's been particularly hard by the Labour budget, particularly around national insurance and issues like business rates. What is the message from the Conservative front bench when it comes to the business in general, but particularly that kind of retail hospitality sector, which is such a large part of our economy?
Yeah, completely. The Conservative Party has clearly decided that it wants to be the party of business again. It went through a period of time, I think, post-Brexit, and Boris Johnson famously saying "F business," where I don't think they felt particularly loved. Rachel Reeves and the team did a pretty effective job in the run-up to the last general election of courting business, getting them on board, and I would argue that was crucial to Labour getting over the line at the election, was that economic credibility. There is a view from business that lots of that economic credibility has been deleted for the government, and the mistakes have been made over the first year. I mean, Sacha Lord, the Andy Burnham's night czar, was a Labour Party member. He was on a panel earlier this week I was listening to where he basically said, I felt like I had the wool pulled over my eyes by the Labour Party. They've come in and done the exact opposite of what they said they would do, and therefore there needs to be real change. So the Conservative Party sees a bit of an opportunity to come back in as the party of business. There's clearly been a concerted effort to engage with the business community. Lots of business people here, lots of former donors here. And actually, the one thing the Conservative Party has done particularly effectively over the past 12 months is raise money. They raised more money than all the other political parties combined this year. And that's coming from business predominantly because the party sees that to be the differentiating factor with Reform, who they don't consider to be economically credible, and the government, who has lost a lot of goodwill over the past 12 months by making those decisions to tax business rather than necessarily individuals. So they are engaging. Lots of business people here. And Mel Stride, Andrew Griffith are around, so the shadow business secretary and the shadow chancellor, putting their arms around business, telling them they want to invest, making sure that fiscal responsibility is the heart of any economic message. It's not a return to Liz Truss. And we caught up actually with Mel Stride and Andrew Griffith just to say, what's your message to business? Let's have a listen.
Hi, I'm Andrew Griffith. Our message for business is we are on your side. The Conservative Party is bringing forward a set of plans to boost business, support entrepreneurs, make sure our country is once again the enterprising nation it needs to be. That will help us grow, and we're on our way back.
I'm here with Sir Mel Stride, the Shadow Chancellor. Mel, what is the Conservative Party's message for business?
That we are the party of business, that businesses are our future. It drives growth, which is actually key to getting a successful economy. And I demonstrated in my speech yesterday, and I said that we will abolish business rates for shops and pubs in High Street, that we're going to use every single lever at our disposal to turbocharge business if we get back into government.
I also caught up with City of London Policy Chairman Chris Hayward and asked him what he thinks the Conservative Party's message to business should be.
I think the message has to be from the city that the city can be the engine room of growth for the whole country. Now, to do that, you need to incentivise the city to grow, keep taxes as low as you possibly can for business, and drive the opportunities to grow the economy. That's what I'm trying to do as the leader of the city. That's what I'd like the Conservatives to tell us they want us to do.
At Lowick Hedgery, we help our clients make sense of a complex world and get things done. Whether it's shaping policy, delivering major projects, or managing your reputation, we bring together deep experience and fresh thinking to get results that matter.
And now you hear it every week on our podcast. Subscribe on Apple, on Spotify, YouTube Music, or wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll drop into your feed every week. All of that is part of a package, isn't it? Well, I've heard £47 billion worth of cuts, which will then be spent on a retail, hospitality and leisure exemption on business rates for properties up to a rateable value of £100,000, which I think would be welcome by that sector. Interestingly, because we haven't heard much about house building and perhaps a pitch to younger people, this idea of a £5,000 tax rebate to help people buy their first home. So very interesting indeed. On the subject of house building, though, I'd be interested in your take, Nathan, because last week Steve Reed was all over Labour conference with his Build Baby Build merch. We had the announcement of the new towns, a big push both for social justice but also intergenerational justice in terms of house building from the Labour Party and from groups like the Labour Growth Group. But we don't seem to see the same and hear the same noises coming out of Conservative Party conference. Is that the case?
So I think that it doesn't have the same cheerleader in the shadow cabinet that it clearly does within the Labour government. And Steve Reed did a good job last week of putting that Build Baby Build central to his kind of conference positioning overall. There is on the fringes of this conference, however, that is where the excitement and ideas are being generated from the grassroots, really. So there's the Conservative YIMBY movement. There's a rally tonight, which I'm going along to, where we'll see the same caps that were given out in red last week, but given out in blue this week, saying Build Baby Build. There's actually quite a lot of consensus from the younger generation that house building has got to be central to any kind of future government prospectus, be that a Labour government, a Conservative government. And again, it's a point of difference with Reform, who clearly aren't putting that front and centre, partly because they need to keep a lot of voters on side who historically have been pretty anti-house building and anti-development in their area. So it is happening. It's just not, I would say that it's not as at the centre of things as it was last week. And that's mainly because there isn't the same cheerleader.
That is very interesting. Also interesting what you say about choices facing Reform. One of the challenges of having such a broad electoral base is you have to choose who you appeal to. And a large chunk of Reform's electorate potentially does not want to be building in their backyard. But interestingly as well, when it comes to intergenerational point, there are still choices for the Conservative Party on the policy front. I mean, Tom Tugendhat said this week that the pensions triple lock is simply not sustainable over the next 20 to 30 years. There are still some big economic questions, fiscal questions that I think all parties have to answer. But it'll be a massive move if a new Conservative leader or even the Conservative Party under Kemi Badenoch moved on an issue such as the triple lock, and only then perhaps will they be able to have a full and pretty intellectually coherent pitch to the younger electorate. I wonder, though, is it too late? Because one thing you and I talk about is what is the kind of event horizon of Conservative Party and reform, and are we near it, or and particularly when it comes to young people? I read a parliamentary sketch this morning from conference saying that whilst the number of members were down, the number of lobbyists were down, which makes sense given it's the party of opposition, not a party of government. Kemi still had her loyal troop of young men with smart haircuts, tweed jackets and chinos. Once those ravens leave the tower, we'll know it's over from Kemi Badenoch. But it sounds like the Tory tweeds and the besooted 20-year-olds are still there.
I think that's true. There is that. Clearly, there is that. There are fewer people here for sure, but that loyal tribe continues to dominate the Midland bar from breakfast, lunch, through to dinner, and into the early hours of the morning, by the looks of it. But to your wider point about the pitch for young people, I think that there is a view within the Conservative Party that unless there is an offer to the next generation, they're finished. I don't think that many people in the Conservative Party necessarily are ready to reckon with the fact that might come with having to deal with things like the triple lock, which probably propagate that intergenerational unfairness a little bit too much. But Conservative Party does need to remember its core vote is still going to be those people receiving pensions and don't really want to wade into that particular political trap, if you like.
I think it would be remiss of us on political business to talk about the future of the Conservative Party from Manchester and London without actually saying, is it worth as a business engaging with the Tories at all? Now, we've already said that regardless of what happens at the next general election, for the next 4 years, the Conservative Party is the official opposition in Parliament, which means they can challenge at the dispatch box, they can table parliamentary questions and use the general tools of Parliament in order to further a policy and political agenda. But given what you've said about the porous nature of the boundary between the Conservative Party and Reform, particularly on the personnel side, if not the electoral side, it strikes me that if actually quite a clever lobbyist would be ensuring that they double up on their Tory lobbying, because one, they might be successful in say the house building, making sure their message lands with the Tory MHCLG and Treasury teams, but who knows if some of those characters from staffers, policy officers, or even indeed members of Parliament might be in Reform in a few years' time. So I think actually it would be remiss of business to write the Tories off, the individuals off on that basis alone. What do you think?
I think that's absolutely right. I think having been to Reform conference just a few weeks ago, the one thing that was very much missing from that was the kind of policy development aspect to conference, which for the major political parties, or the historically major political parties, has always been such a feature of conference. That think tank, that drinks reception, that policy report that's just been released and is in front of senior policymakers and decision makers. All of that is, I would describe as the kind of intellectual infrastructure that sits behind a major political party. Reform doesn't have. When we go back to the beginning and say, well, what can the Conservative Party offer Reform in any future deal? Well, it is that infrastructure, and you see it. You will see that in the nature of right-leaning think tanks, right-leaning policy developments, right-leaning public affairs consultancies and others, basically doing that work for Reform and then importing it from one to the other. So, and I think that, frankly, as I've also said, given that there are likely to be more defectors over the next 12 months, you might be engaging with a Tory today that will be wearing a turquoise rosette in 12 months' time. So it is definitely still worth it here. And business has obviously decided that. In amongst all the chatter that there's nobody here and nobody's turned up, there are actually quite a few businesses here, and they're being looked after because, frankly, they're paying for the whole show to continue. So that they are,
they want to get a hearing. I mean, I guess exactly. if you're a Labour in the Labour attack unit, if that such a thing still exists, you'd be pushing the line in due course. buy Reform, get Conservative. But actually, I think if you are in the, if you're a business, a lobbyist operating in the right-wing ecosystem of Reform, the Conservatives, but also, as you say, that kind of think tank ecosystem around both parties, then actually the smart person is buying Tory and getting Reform later.
Kevin, what's our advice for this week?
The Tories are in opposition, in reality, even if not setting the agenda. So cancel engagement with them at your risk.
Tories are listening to business again, at pains to put fiscal responsibility and a pro-business agenda at the heart of their conference. Very much an open door if you're a business looking to engage.
And whilst there might be talk about Reform merging with the Tories or even doing a pact, it's clear that the personnel boundary between the two parties is very, very porous. So buy Tory now, get Reform later.
Thanks for joining us on Political Business, where we give you our trusted advice in the changing landscape all around us.
To get more of what you've just heard, subscribe to the podcast and join us each week. Look us up online, as on LinkedIn, and find out more about what we do. Speak to you next week.
Bye now.